The broadcast that shook the world. The stage lights blazed hot and white across the sprawling set of the Global Mind Exchange, a televised roundtable where the world's most brilliant minds and beloved figures came together to discuss ideas shaping the future. Cameras hovered from above, trained on the polished table where 6 chairs stood ready. The world was watching, literally. Over 80 million people had tuned in. The stakes were high. In one seat sat Elon Musk, tech titan, visionary, and billionaire. He adjusted his dark suit jacket, leaned back confidently, and tapped his fingers on the glass table. Known for his daring ideas, blunt honesty, and occasional controversy, Elon was here to talk about artificial intelligence and the future of consciousness. Across from him, in calm contrast, sat Keanu Reeves. Wearing a simple black blazer over a charcoal shirt, Keanu didn't look like he belonged on a tech panel. But he did. Known for more than just his iconic film roles, Keanu had recently become a quiet champion of ethical technology. His investments in mental health startups, digital well-being platforms, and environmental sustainability had begun to get serious attention. Yet, he never bragged, never chased the spotlight. Today, he was here not as an actor, but as a humanitarian. The panel discussion was meant to be a conversation, a meeting of minds, but no one expected what would happen next. 15 minutes into the show, the conversation had turned toward the development of humanoid robots. Elon, with fire in his eyes, leaned forward and said, "The future isn't emotional. It's efficient. Emotions are noise. Humanity has held back its own evolution with feelings like guilt, fear, and nostalgia. If we're going to survive the next century, we need to cut the strings of empathy." The audience went quiet. Keanu looked at Elon. He didn't speak right away. He gently rubbed the ring on his right hand, a small gesture he did whenever he was processing something deeply. Then he leaned toward the microphone and said in his calm, grounded voice, "With all due respect, Elon, without emotions, we have no reason to survive." The host blinked. Elon smirked. "So says the actor," he fired back, half laughing. The tension in the room thickened. Cameras zoomed in. Live chat feeds exploded. Keanu didn't flinch. He leaned back, took a breath, and looked not at Elon, but directly at the camera. "I want to tell you a story." He said it softly. The producers weren't sure if this was scripted, but they didn't dare cut the feed. "A few years ago," Keanu began, "I was walking through downtown LA late at night. No cameras, no security. Just me. I passed a young man sitting on the sidewalk. He had a cardboard sign that read, 'I'm not hungry, just lonely.'" The entire studio went silent. I sat next to him. We talked for almost an hour. He told me how he lost his family in a fire, how he didn't want money, just someone to talk to. And you know what stayed with me most? Not his story, but how he thanked me. Keanu's voice grew a little quieter. He said, "You're the first person who looked at me like I was still human." He paused. His eyes were misty, but steady. "So if the future doesn't have space for feelings like empathy, I don't want that future. Because the most human thing we can ever do is care." Elon's response. Elon leaned forward, clearly uncomfortable now. He tried to cut in, but Keanu gently raised a hand. "I'm not here to argue, Elon," he said. "I'm here to remind the world that innovation without soul is just machinery." Somewhere in the back row, someone began clapping. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire studio erupted into applause. Elon stared straight ahead, blinking. For once, he didn't have a comeback. The world reacts. Within hours, the clip went viral. Hashtags like #KeenanKnows, #EmotionMatters, and #HumanityFirst trended worldwide. Keanu's words became memes, quotes, songs. Journalists scrambled to write op-eds. Commentators hailed it as one of the most powerful moments in live television history. But for Keanu, it wasn't about going viral. That night, he went home quietly, answered no interviews, and donated $2 million to a charity that offered free therapy for homeless youth. The world couldn't stop talking about it, but he never talked about it again. When the world tried to cancel him, he chose kindness again. The morning after the now legendary broadcast, the world awoke divided. The clip of Keanu Reeves gently but powerfully countering Elon Musk's emotionless vision of the future had amassed hundreds of millions of views across all platforms. On one side were those praising Keanu as the voice of conscience, the soul of the century, one outlet dubbed him. But not everyone agreed. Powerful critics, especially in the business and tech world, didn't like what he said, and certainly didn't like how the public was receiving it. For the first time in years, Keanu found himself at the center of not just admiration, but controversy. He hadn't anticipated the storm. As soon as the sun rose over Los Angeles, a tidal wave of articles, tweets, and opinion videos erupted across the internet. Tech bloggers called him emotionally manipulative. A well-known podcast host accused him of romanticizing weakness. Some even edited the clip to make it appear that Keanu had staged the story about the homeless man, insinuating that it was all just performance. Fake exposes began circulating. Words like fraud, attention seeker, and washed-up actor were suddenly being thrown around. And yet, Keanu remained completely silent. In a quiet home nestled in the hills, far from the noise and traffic of the city, Keanu Reeves sat on the floor of his meditation room. No phones, no news, just him, a small candle, and the echo of silence. When his longtime assistant, Elise, walked in with a worried expression and an iPad filled with headlines, he simply looked up and smiled gently. "Elise," he said softly, "I didn't say what I said for them. I said it for the boy on the sidewalk." His voice was calm, centered, not defensive, just honest. "You're trending in 47 countries," she whispered, "and they're calling you a liar." Keanu stood up slowly and walked toward the window. Outside, the sky was turning golden. Birds chirped, trees swayed, and a fox trotted across the edge of the yard. "I don't care if I'm trending," he said, "but if I'm going to be seen, I might as well say something real." Instead of issuing a statement or hiring a PR team to fight the smear campaign, Keanu did something no one expected. He visited a youth shelter in downtown Los Angeles, the very same one he had quietly funded for years. Cameras followed him, of course, but he didn't call them. He didn't pose. He simply walked in, greeted everyone by name, and sat in a circle with a group of teens. "I know things are noisy right now," he said to them, his voice soft. "But noise isn't truth. Sometimes the truth is found in silence, or in the way someone looks at you when you feel invisible." One girl, barely 16, broke down crying. "I don't want to live in a world without people like you," she whispered. Keanu knelt down beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to," he said. "You are that person." Later that night, someone from the shelter posted a photo, no filter, no edits, of Keanu washing dishes in the back kitchen while laughing with the staff. It wasn't meant to go viral, but it did. The image ignited a wildfire of support. Celebrities who had stayed silent began speaking up. A-list actors, journalists, even a few tech leaders shared their stories of quiet kindness from Keanu over the years. One producer recalled how Keanu once gave away 70% of his salary from a major film to fund the special effects team's families during a difficult time. Another told how Keanu personally bought groceries for an entire neighborhood after a wildfire wiped out their homes. But the most powerful post came from an anonymous source, a woman who had been homeless for 3 years. 10 years ago, she wrote, "A man gave me his coat and sat beside me on a snowy night. He didn't just offer me warmth. He offered me time. That man was Keanu Reeves. I got clean. I found a job. I have 2 kids now. He saved my life without ever knowing it." No hashtags, no plea for attention, just truth. And that was all it took. Back in his home, Keanu refused to read any of the news. Instead, he called a close friend, a retired teacher in her 80s, someone he had known since he was a teenager. Her voice came through the speakerphone, warm and steady. "Keanu," she said, "they can't cancel someone who tells the truth with kindness." He laughed softly. "I didn't know kindness was so controversial." She replied, "That's how you know it matters." Then the unexpected happened. A formal letter arrived. An invitation, not from a talk show, not from a movie studio, but from a global ethics council that held only one summit every decade. They wanted Keanu to speak, not as a celebrity, not as an actor, but as a human being. He stared at the letter in his hands for a long time. "Elise," he finally said, "book me a flight, but no private jet this time. Coach seat, middle row." She stared at him confused. He smiled. "If I'm going to talk about empathy, I better sit between two strangers first." And so, while the world buzzed with debate, edits, and hashtags, Keanu boarded a regular flight with no security detail and no announcement. No one recognized him at first. He offered his snacks to the boy on his left, helped the elderly woman on his right with her seatbelt, and spent the entire flight reading a book on ancient philosophy. He never mentioned Elon. He never defended himself. Because Keanu Reeves knew something that many had forgotten. Kindness doesn't need to fight back. It just needs to show up. The speech that silenced a nation. The Grand Hall of the International Ethics Summit was unlike any place Keanu Reeves had ever spoken in. It wasn't a film premiere. There were no flashing lights, no screaming fans. Instead, it was quiet, reverently so. Hundreds of delegates from every corner of the globe, from scientists to spiritual leaders, CEOs to human rights activists, sat in rows of polished oak chairs. Each had been invited not because of fame or fortune, but because of impact. This was a place where words had weight, where actions mattered more than applause. Keanu walked in without fanfare, wearing the same black jacket he always wore. No stylist, no entourage, just him, holding a small piece of folded paper in his hand. The speech he wasn't even sure he'd give. When the moderator introduced him, there were polite claps. Some attendees exchanged curious glances, unsure why an actor had been invited to a gathering that rarely welcomed anyone from Hollywood. But those who had watched the Global Mind Exchange broadcast, who had seen his exchange with Elon Musk, leaned forward in anticipation. As Keanu approached the podium, he unfolded the paper, looked at it for a moment, and then set it down. "I was going to read from this," he began softly, his voice steady, "but I realized I didn't write this with my heart. I wrote it with worry. Worry about saying the right thing, sounding clever, or fitting in." He looked out across the room. "But I didn't come here to fit in. I came here to be honest." A hush swept over the crowd. "I've spent most of my life pretending," Keanu said. "That's my job. I've played assassins, revolutionaries, meshes. I've worn the faces of so many people that, for a while, I forgot my own. But when the cameras are off, and the costumes are gone, I'm just a man. And what I've learned, the hard way, is that being human is not a weakness. It's the most powerful thing we can be." There was no dramatic flair in his tone, no scripted pauses, just a man telling the truth. "I've seen what money can do, what genius can build. I've shaken hands with men who've put satellites in the sky and built machines that talk back. But I've also seen what love can do. I've watched a mother feed 3 children on one meal because her husband walked out. I've seen a war veteran hug the man who once called him a monster. And I've held the hand of someone dying who said their only regret was not loving louder." He paused then, his eyes shimmering, not with performance, but with memory. "So when someone tells me that emotions are a flaw, I ask, how do you define progress, if not by how much we care?" People in the crowd began to shift in their seats, not out of restlessness, but because something inside them was stirring. "We build rockets to Mars. We make robots that smile. But we still let children sleep on sidewalks. We still scroll past pain because it's inconvenient. We still confuse intelligence with wisdom. Keanu stepped away from the podium, walking closer to the edge of the stage. I'm not here to argue with Elon Musk. He's brilliant. I admire his ambition. But when we dream of the future, let's not forget the parts of us that ache, that love, that break and rebuild. That's where real evolution happens, not in code, but in compassion. He took a deep breath. I've lived through loss. I've buried people I loved. I sat alone in hotel rooms wondering what all of this, fame, fortune, really means. And I've come to this conclusion. His voice dropped to a whisper. If we don't put our hearts into the future, we won't belong in it. The room fell silent. No rustling, no clapping, just silence. And then, slowly, one hand rose. A woman in the front row, an elder from a tribal nation, stood. She placed her hand on her chest and bowed her head. A second later, a climate scientist did the same. Then a monk, a tech CEO. One by one, they rose, not clapping, but standing in quiet recognition of something rare. Truth. Raw, unpolished, and human. The next morning, headlines around the world didn't scream scandal or controversy. They didn't spin his words or twist them into clickbait. Instead, they simply read. Keanu Reeves reminds the world what it means to be human. Clips of his speech flooded the internet. Students played it in classrooms. Soldiers shared it in mess halls. Parents showed it to their children. And in unexpected corners of the world, small towns, refugee camps, community centers, people gathered to watch not a movie, but a message. A message that didn't rely on status or special effects. Just honesty. Back in Los Angeles, Keanu quietly returned to his regular life. He didn't accept interviews. He didn't cash in on endorsements. He resumed his daily walks, his motorbike rides through the city, his occasional drop-ins at local cafes where staff had grown used to him tipping 500% and never asking for anything in return. But something had shifted. People began looking at each other differently, a little more gently, a little more willing to listen. And in the silence that followed his speech, something remarkable began to grow, something no machine could ever replicate. Empathy. Elon's unexpected call. Days passed, then weeks. The aftershock of Keanu Reeves' unforgettable speech at the International Ethics Summit still echoed across the globe. Commentators had run out of adjectives. Politicians quoted him in Parliament. Tech firms began quietly reevaluating how they framed human connection in their roadmaps. His words, "If we don't put our hearts into the future, we won't belong in it," were etched into digital timelines like scripture. But behind all the praise, behind the curtain of applause and analysis, one man had remained silent. Elon Musk. He hadn't tweeted. Not a word. No interviews, no rebuttals, no reaction. It wasn't like him. Even his closest engineers at Tesla and SpaceX whispered about the change. Elon had been unusually quiet in meetings. He no longer interrupted ideas with blunt dismissals. He stared more out of windows than at spreadsheets. Something about that night on live TV, about Keanu's calm defiance, had lingered in him. And then one night, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He picked up the phone. It was close to midnight in Los Angeles when Keanu's phone vibrated on the nightstand, beside his well-worn copy of Letters to a Young Poet. He reached for it with tired fingers, expecting another missed call, or perhaps a message from one of the shelters he supported. Instead, the screen read, "Incoming call, Elon Musk." Keanu blinked. He considered ignoring it. But something in him, curiosity, maybe, told him to answer. He slid his finger across the screen and simply said, "Hello." A pause. Then Elon's unmistakable voice, calmer than usual, came through. "Hey, Keanu. I'm not calling to argue." Keanu didn't reply right away. He walked over to the window, gazing out at the dark city skyline. "All right," He said, "Then what are you calling for?" Elon hesitated. "I guess. I'm trying to understand." There it was. Vulnerability. Uneven, unfamiliar, but real. They spoke for over an hour. Elon admitted he'd watched Keanu's speech 3 times, not as a CEO, not as an innovator, but as a man who, despite all his success, still felt like he was missing something important. He shared how often he wrestled with the weight of responsibility, how people expected him to build the future but never asked how he was feeling about it. He confessed he hadn't cried in years. "I've coded things that simulate empathy," he said, "but I'm starting to think I forgot how to feel it myself." Keanu didn't lecture. He didn't tell Elon what to do. He just listened. And when Elon finally fell quiet, Keanu offered only one question. "Do you remember the last time you hugged someone without needing a reason?" Elon didn't answer. The silence between them was more telling than any words. Later that week, the world gasped again. Not because of a speech, not because of a scandal, but because of a photo. It showed Keanu Reeves and Elon Musk sitting side by side on a park bench in downtown Los Angeles. No suits, no cameras, no security. They were watching a group of kids play basketball at a community center Keanu had quietly helped fund for years. Elon, wearing a plain hoodie and sneakers, looked nothing like the tech mogul people expected. Keanu, dressed just as simply, was handing out bottled water to the players between games. It wasn't stage. It wasn't publicized. It was simply human. When asked later by a journalist what the two talked about that day, Keanu smiled gently and replied, "We didn't talk much. We watched. We laughed. We let the silence do the healing." And when Elon was later asked by an intern what changed his mind, he responded, "I thought we were building machines to save the world. Turns out, the world doesn't need saving. It needs remembering." The news cycle struggled to frame what had happened. There was no rivalry now. No drama to stoke. Just 2 powerful men on a bench, rediscovering what it meant to be people first. Inspired by their unlikely friendship, community projects began to sprout all over, some funded by Elon's quiet donations, others by Keanu's influence. A joint initiative called The Human Code was born, focused on bringing ethics, empathy, and emotional literacy into AI and robotics education. Their first event, a storytelling workshop for underprivileged teens, not in Silicon Valley, but in a modest gymnasium in the Bronx. And so, while the world watched in awe, the real change didn't happen on screens or stages. It happened in quiet conversations, in handwritten letters, in strangers offering kindness without condition. And it all started because one man refused to trade his soul for applause. The day Keanu said no to $1 billion. The story should have ended there. 2 giants finding common ground. The world learning something rare about grace. But for Keanu Reeves, this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a deeper test of character, one that would soon reveal the true weight of his beliefs, not in theory, not in words, but in sacrifice. It came quietly, like most things that change a life. A discreet meeting was arranged in the heart of Silicon Valley. A tech conglomerate, one of the largest in the world, had been watching the ripple effect of Keanu's viral speech, his friendship with Elon, and his quiet influence on millions. But they didn't want to praise him. They wanted to own him. In a glass tower with chrome walls and floating desks, Keanu sat across from 5 executives, all in tailored suits worth more than most cars. They offered coffee, compliments, and smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Then came the pitch. "We want to create the Keanu Reeves Human Empathy Eye," said the CEO, sliding a sleek folder across the table. "Imagine your voice, your image, your philosophies, all turned into a global digital companion. It will help people, comfort them, counsel them." Keanu listened quietly. It sounded noble, useful, even. Then came the twist. "We're offering a $1 billion contract, up front. plus shares, royalties, full creative input. On paper, you own it. But in practice, it would be, well, our most human product ever. He stared at the folder for a long time. Inside were mock-ups, his face smiling at a digital user, his voice softly narrating inspirational quotes, his likeness rendered with AI precision. On the surface, it looked like a tribute. But beneath it was something cold. They weren't honoring him. They were replicating him. He leaned back in his chair, letting the silence grow thick. "You want to turn my soul into software," he finally said, voice low, thoughtful. The room shifted uncomfortably. "Not your soul," one executive chuckled nervously. "Just your image. Your message. My humanity," Keanu interrupted gently. "That's what you're buying. The way I pause before I speak. The way I look people in the eyes. The tremble in my voice when I talk about loss. You can't program that. You can imitate it, but you can't live it." One of the younger executives leaned forward. "But think of how many people it could help. Imagine someone feeling lost at 3 a.m. and being able to talk to you. Imagine children in remote places hearing your stories, guided by your digital presence." Keanu's eyes softened. "I don't need $1 billion to be there for someone," he replied. "I already am. And when I'm gone, I don't want a machine pretending to care. I want real people to care for each other." The offer was declined. Not with arrogance, not with outrage, but with the quiet grace that had come to define Keanu Reeves. He stood, thanked them for their time, and left the folder untouched on the table. Word of the meeting should have stayed private, but it didn't. Within days, someone leaked the story. Keanu Reeves turns down $1 billion AI deal to stay human became the most shared headline of the year. Fans were stunned. Critics were silenced. Even Elon Musk tweeted for the first time in weeks. Respect. Real value isn't in code, it's in character. But Keanu didn't post about it. He didn't defend his decision or explain it in interviews. He simply continued his quiet mission, visiting schools, supporting mental health programs, and attending funerals of strangers who had written to him during hard times. He didn't need artificial immortality. He believed in presence, not permanence. And when asked later by a young student at a public speaking event why he walked away from that much money, Keanu smiled gently and said, $1 billion can build many things, but it can't build me again. So why sell something that's already priceless?" In a world obsessed with legacy, Keanu Reeves chose truth over trend, humanity over hardware. And in doing so, he gave the world something it didn't expect. Not another product, but permission. Permission to say no, to walk away, to protect what cannot be bought. The moment that brought the world to tears. It had been 6 months since Keanu Reeves walked out of that glass tower in Silicon Valley without the $1 billion deal. Since then, he had become something more than a celebrity, something deeper than a public figure. Around the world, his name had come to mean something else entirely. Integrity. It wasn't just that he spoke kindly, it was that he lived kindly. The world had watched him time and time again choose people over profit, silence over spectacle, and dignity over dominance. But no one knew what was coming next. Not even Keanu. It started with a letter. Handwritten. On creased, lined paper. No stamp. Just slid under the door of a community center in Brooklyn where Keanu had recently visited. No name, no return address. Just one sentence at the top. "You saved my life. And you don't even know it." Inside, the letter unfolded into something extraordinary. It was written by a 12-year-old boy named Marcus. He explained how, months earlier, he had watched Keanu's emotional speech on his teacher's cracked laptop in a struggling inner-city classroom. That day, Marcus had been planning to run away from home. He had packed a bag. He was tired of being ignored, of being bullied, of feeling invisible. But then he watched Keanu talk about humanity, about emotions not being weakness but strength, about how pain meant you were still alive, and love meant you still had something worth fighting for. "I don't know why," Marcus wrote, "but I stayed. I put the bag down. I told my mom I loved her for the first time in 2 years." The final line was written in shaky pencil. "You reminded me I matter." Keanu read the letter in the quiet of his home. No cameras, no social media post, just him, and the slow stream of tears that filled his eyes. He had played many heroes in movies, but this was real. This was one life, saved, and it was enough. He traveled to Brooklyn the next day without telling anyone. No security, no press, just a backpack and that folded letter. After hours of searching and asking around, he found Marcus, not at home, not on a red carpet, but at a tiny neighborhood library, helping a younger student learn to read. Keanu didn't interrupt. He waited until the lesson ended, then quietly approached. "Hey," he said gently, "are you Marcus?" The boy looked up, eyes wide. "Yes." Keanu pulled the letter from his jacket. "I believe this belongs to you." Marcus froze. His hands trembled. His voice cracked. "You came." Keanu knelt down to his level. "You wrote something powerful, something true, and I wanted to thank you in person for reminding me why it all matters." Tears streamed down the boy's face. He leaped into Keanu's arms, and for the first time in his life, Marcus felt what millions had only seen from a distance. Real love, real presence, real humanity. A library worker captured a single grainy photo of that moment, Marcus hugging Keanu with his face buried in the man's shoulder, both of them crying softly. The photo wasn't staged, it wasn't meant to go viral. But it did. And for once, the internet didn't mock, didn't twist. It simply stood still and felt. Later that year, Keanu was asked to accept a global humanitarian award. World leaders, tech moguls, and changemakers filled the audience. But when it was time for him to speak, he did something unexpected. He invited Marcus on stage with him. The boy was dressed in a suit 2 sizes too big, his tie slightly crooked. Keanu placed the trophy in his hands. "He deserves this more than I do," he said, "because he chose to stay. He chose to love. And that is the most courageous thing anyone can do." The room erupted in a standing ovation. Even Elon Musk stood, with tears in his eyes. Years later, when asked what legacy he hoped to leave behind, Keanu Reeves didn't talk about movies or awards. He didn't mention money or fame. He simply said, "I hope people remember I listened. I showed up. And I believed every life matters, even the ones the world overlooks." And so, in the story that began with a live TV shutdown and nearly ended in a billion-dollar offer, the final scene wasn't about business or power. It was about a hug in a library, a boy who chose to live, and a man who proved that sometimes the most heroic thing we can do is care.